are bringing us all our food deliveries, that are caring for our children. The second thing is homeownership disparities persist. In Minnesota, 77% of white households are homeowners, and just 25% or less of Black households are homeowners. And that's among the worst disparities in the country. Third, housing costs are rising. Over the last 10 years, while renter incomes have decreased by 1%, rent itself has increased by 14%. So that gap and that spread is persisting and increasing. Fourth, cost burden disparities are being magnified. Overall, more than 25% of households pay more than they can afford for rent. And those burdens hit hardest for people of color. And in fact, that cost burden rises to more than 58% of Black renters. And finally, wages are not keeping up with housing. And yet, it's all those low-earning jobs, for example, that are central to healthcare. Those are the jobs that are expected to have the largest job growth. So today, our discussion is focused around how do we move beyond business as usual towards more bold and equitable outcomes that we're all trying to accomplish. Because we're in a moment, right? We're in a moment of these enormous challenges, but also a moment of enormous opportunity. So today we're going to have a really amazing panel of experts to talk about how each of their organizations are approaching this moment, where they see the risks, where they see opportunities, and some real changes that are needed and are happening right now. And we'll have a perspective from a large lender, US Bank, from a developer, and a national nonprofit perspective. But we'll get to the panel in just a moment, because first I'm delighted to welcome our Minnesota Housing Commissioner, Jennifer Ho. And Commissioner Ho has a lot on her plate these days, figuring out how to deploy the state's share of $375 million in rental assistance as one thing to keep people from being evicted. She's trying to navigate and negotiate with state legislative leaders to secure what MHP and other housing advocates hope is up to $400 million in housing infrastructure bonds to get all this needed housing built, and so much more. So, you know, Jennifer, be innovative and be bold. I don't know if you ever sleep, but welcome.
Well, I love the 7:45 start time, Ann. That's fantastic. But thanks for having people turn their cameras on. I really do appreciate seeing you. I appreciate seeing you at this hour of the morning. I miss being with people. And I just also, I long for the inefficiency of hallway time. And I think that we should figure out how to embrace that and not think that hopping from platform to platform is going to be the new way of doing things, because I think we all know that this work is ultimately relational. It's an honor to be here this morning, Gary, with you. Nawal, it's great to see you this morning. Vihar, this is a great lineup, and this is a timely topic. I was thinking, Ann, recently that yes, we are in a moment, but it seems like 2 years ago, the phrase was we need a minute. And we said we need a minute for something that was going to take 3 years, you know? That was kind of the colloquial phrase. And now we have even less than a minute, we have a moment. And yet the work that we have to do is so important. So I hope that moment is simply metaphorical for the time that we're in. The way I want to talk about this is really through three prisms. I want to talk about what it means to be bold on equity, to go big on equity, as I would say, for the agency. I want to talk about the way that I see this playing out in the conversation with the state and with the feds, and to do that all in just a couple minutes. First of all, I'm pleased to announce that Brittany Rice is the agency's new Director of Equity and Inclusion. She'll be coming to us in mid-April from the City of Minneapolis Department of Civil Rights, and I hope that you all welcome her. Her job is not to do the equity work of the agency, but to teach the agency how to do equity work. So she's got 260 students inside the agency that she'll be helping along the way. And for those of you who are well-versed in it, I hope that you will welcome Brittany and give her the company of people who are ahead on the journey to help those of us who are beginning get there. So help me in welcoming Brittany in mid-April. You know, I think the agency has been doing some important work. We've done some work in our qualified allocation plan to better reach and serve disparately impacted populations and to increase equity across the state. That's a quote right out of the plan. We've shifted points, we've updated our language, and we're seeing it play out in the way that we're doing selections. In terms of giving more points to Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned agencies, women-owned agencies, but also just really thinking about how we buy down the rent so that the places that we create are affordable to people who make the least. We've brought in equity experts, Sina Hodges, Ansa Achea, Lisa Tabor and team to really help us think about how we do the work, both in terms of providing basic skills to my leadership team so that we can lead in this space, and asking important questions about equity up front as we design new stimulus programs that we're putting into place. And so, you know, inside the agency, this is something that we are attacking on many levels. I think, you know, it's a personal journey, it's a policy journey, it's a funding journey. You know, it's a what do we look like and what does it mean to be at Minnesota Housing? It's something I'm thinking about a lot as we begin to anticipate what it means to go back. So up at the Capitol, yeah, you know, I mean, the House and Senate are at slightly different places. They too are on their own journeys, and each of their members are on their own journeys. You know, but I think that for the first time, we're really hearing a conversation around the history and present day impact of structural racism in the housing system. We're hearing people talk about the disgrace of the disparities in homeownership. And so the conversation of naming it has become more real. And I think the question of what are we going to do about it is, you know, one where we're still dealing with divided government, and how this plays out over time is really up to each and every one of us on this call to shape. You know, the governor and lieutenant governor are putting their money where their mouth is in terms of investments. Got $18.5 million on the table over above base for one-time funding across a lot of our programs. We've got the starting point of 100 million on the housing infrastructure bonds, but it kind of has seemed to be the governor and lieutenant governor's inclination that if folks want to go bigger than that, that we're not gonna oppose that. And we have policy bills on the table around tenants' rights. You know, that's kind of a new space for the agency to be playing in that space. But we really believe that we can't have discrimination based on source of income. We really believe that there should be a slightly longer process built into evictions, especially as we think about the off-ramp to the evictions moratorium, and giving people the opportunity to have time to be able to access the new COVID-19 emergency rental assistance program, which will be up and running soon, my favorite government word. There'll be more information on how to get ready to apply available next week. I'm fairly confident. Since my phone didn't just light up with text, I'm going to stick with that. But also, I think, you know, I think this is a real opportunity right now federally. What we saw in the December stimulus and what we saw in the March stimulus packages really were enormous statements on housing. And it's really good to know that Senator Smith is so well positioned as the chair of the new subcommittee on housing and community development. There are a couple more words in there. It's great to see the first language out of the Biden administration on housing that talks about structural systemic racism and the need for equity in housing. It was great to hear Secretary Fudge speak at the National Council of State Housing Agencies yesterday and phrases that were familiar to us in a previous era ringing out again. So I just want to say, yes, stimulus, stimulus, stimulus. My team is working really hard on that with so many important partners across the state. And the next chapter is infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. We know that housing is infrastructure, and we can embed equity if we do it from the get-go in terms of how we approach all these new investments. So looking forward to working with all of you on that. And Anne, I know you run a tight shop, so that's what I got.
I very much appreciate that, Commissioner, and we always appreciate your being present with us. I think it's really important that we continue to have just these open and productive relationships between the agency and folks that are on the ground doing this work. So thank you so much for making yourself available. So yes, tight shop. So without further ado, I want to do a brief introduction and start our panel off with Gary Cunningham, who is the president and CEO of Prosperity Now. He became that, he took that role on in August 2019. And I think his full bio, I think we're going to be able to put in the chat for you. I'll just say he's not a stranger to almost anyone on this call at all. He spent years in the trenches working to build economic opportunity for African Americans and other people of color right here in the Twin Cities as the president and CEO of MEDA, the Metropolitan Economic Development Association. And lots of other leadership roles. Again, we'll put most of that in the chat, so I don't take away from your time, Gary, to share some of your insights from your perch of this national perspective. What are you seeing as, again, those risks and opportunities, and how do we make something important happen from this moment we're in? Gary?
Well, thank you, Anne. And I just want to say this is such a gift to see such dear friends on this phone call. I don't want to call everybody out, but I do want to say that I remember in the 80s and early 90s working with Paul Williams on the issue of bringing more professionals in the community development field, and working on issues of how do we get more home ownership for people of color. Warren Hansen, Harry Melander, I could just go on the list, working with Kathy Timbrook on the Affordable Housing Incentive Fund when she was in Gail Dorfman's office, et cetera. It's just really, really emotional for me to be here back in my home state, so to speak. But I just want to say, for those of you that don't know Prosperity Now is an organization that has been around about 40 years. It has been in the forefront of the work on building assets and wealth throughout the country, and has had some big wins over the years on issues of earned income tax credit and issues of manufactured housing and other areas. I could go on. We actually do research. We're a policy advocacy shop. We're a think and do take. We actually have programs around the country, some in Minnesota. In fact, we have a project we're working on right now on the racial wealth divide, with working with communities of color, specifically building the capacity of organizations of color in 16 cities across the country. And I could just go on. We do a lot of different work. But part of what we do is also on the federal level. We actually advocate for changes in policy at the federal level. Our goals are really about how do we create a fair and just economy that's really free from structural inequality and racism, an economy where everyone can fully participate across their life cycle, where households can build sustainable wealth through generations, and communities can prosper without exception. Next slide, please. So this issue that we're trying to deal with, and I had a whole lot of slides, but I boiled it down to this. These issues are not simplistic issues. As I said, many of us have been working most of our lives on these issues. But when we look at the components of the racial economic wealth divide, it has these components: poverty, income, assets, debt, and wealth. In a 2016 study that we did, we calculated that would take 242 years for African Americans to reach the same level of wealth that whites have today if nothing's done. So if we continue on the trajectory we have, we will continue to see these huge income inequalities. In fact, we did another study that showed that by that blacks will have zero wealth by 2058. So think about that, zero wealth as we look at these issues. Next slide, please. This issue is the Achilles heel of America, the racial wealth divide. If we can't solve this issue, given the demographic shifts, then we are going to, basically, we're not only harming people of color, we're harming the white society won't be able to survive as well. We're, you know, as Martin Luther King once said, we might have come in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And so this question of solving this issue isn't just an issue that we can say just solve it for African Americans. This issue actually has huge implications for the quality and the status of life for everyone. And I think Harry Melander and I worked on the Thrive 2040 document for the Metropolitan Council, where it clearly pointed out that this issue sits at the center of transforming the country, but also the state of Minnesota. Therefore, it's critical we develop the means by which this challenge of home ownership can be addressed. And this graphic shows that if we were to have parity in home ownership, we could cut the racial wealth divide by 1/3 approximately for both Black and Latino families. So it sits as one of the big solutions that we need to take on. Next slide. We know that asset building is a key component in closing the racial wealth divide. And Ann already went over these figures, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. But you know, where Minnesota sits is disgraceful and shameful. And so, you know, I'm not trying to shame folks necessarily, but something significant has to happen in Minnesota, given where it sits in the national picture. For BIPOC communities, specifically African-American communities in Minnesota. Next slide, please. And then, you know, in Minnesota, white households in Minnesota have a higher rate of approvals for mortgage applications than households of other races and ethnicities. And I don't think this is any new news, so I'm just going to keep moving through the slides because this is things that I think most people on this call really realize. And the real question that I need to ask is, where is the political will to address these questions that are out here? And that's part of the issue. There's also a higher share of the households of color, depending on your census tract, the estimated market value. And I think all of you know that there's been uncovered huge disparities in how housing evaluations and assessments throughout the country, but Minnesota leads the pack again in these issues of how communities of color even if they do everything right and they, you know, follow all the rules, their home values because of where they live is going to be significantly lower than other folks across the state. Keep going, please. So it's not a new crisis. We all know that. This chart just points that out. But I think that the important thing about this chart is the question of it's not only a home ownership issue, it is also an issue of renters. And I would go so far as to say that it's also an issue of people in homelessness. And so this thing is all across every spectrum. I frame this as we have a market failure. And the market failure is just not on the lower end of the market. I was the county administrator in Scott County, which is one of the richest counties in Minnesota. And in that county, the affordable housing crisis was a little different in that people kids that live in that community couldn't actually live there. And so you have a broken system at the top of the market where people can't live, and you have a broken system at the bottom part of the market. And so when does government play a role? Government has to play a role at the point where there is market failure, where supply doesn't meet demand. And I would say in Minnesota, but across the country, we have a market failure with regards to housing and how we're addressing housing. And the current solutions just aren't going to be big enough to get us there. We're going to have to do something really big to change the trajectory. Next slide, please. So as Ann said earlier, we can seize this moment for real change. How can we respond differently to the crisis that has made this lasting impact on so many communities? Next slide, please. So some of the policies that are moving right now, and given that the new administration is in play, but reinstating the 2015 affirmatively furthering fair housing rule is critical. That rule began to take root and change the trajectory of how the analysis for impediments to fair housing, this issue of how we look at this community, and get communities coming to grips with all of the facts that I just talked about. Expanding household choice vouchers to meet the full need instead of partial need. Expanding the leverage existing public resources to further encourage the development of affordable housing. And reform existing upside down housing tax incentives. Because right now, our tax incentives actually not only exacerbate, but are fundamentally the reason that our wealth divide is growing, where a very small segment of the population is capturing most of the tax benefits that are out there. And then mostly low income and middle income people are falling further and further behind because of how our tax system is upside down. Next slide, please. So I promised that I wouldn't go through a complicated analysis for you this morning because I know how those can be, especially early in the morning. So I'm gonna walk you through a very simplistic chart of our when I say our Prosperity Now's pathway to housing for all. And it encompasses the whole gamut of housing. Our pathway to housing proposal outlines a pathway from supporting low-income renters to home ownership in 4 phases. Number 1, the phase, is annual low-income renter credits for households that are low income and rent cost burdens, providing them with $1,000 to $3,000 a credit. Phase 2, a pre-purchase down payment builder match savings program for low-income households that provide a 1-to-1 match of $4,000 maximum, $2,000 from the household and $2,000 match. And phase 3, a post-purchase first-time home buyer credit for low-income households. And phase 4, a homeowner's post-purchase tax credit for all households, irrespective of income, that would provide $1,200 annually. And the reason that we're framing it this way is that we actually are framing this around a targeted universalist strategy. One of the things that we have learned is that the way that we frame these issues today is that many whites in particular don't see themselves in the picture. Part of the reason we haven't been able to make progress on these issues is because of what Putnam and others call white backlash. What we've seen is that every time we make progress on issues of civil rights and a fair economy within this country, we have a backlash that occurs. And so we're trying to reframe this question in what we call targeted universalism, and I'll explain that real quickly. So we believe that we have to frame our goals in a universal way so that everybody benefits. Everybody sees themselves in the picture. That is not just about people of color benefiting, but whites can also see themselves in the picture. We also believe that universal strategies alone don't get to populations of color. Those strategies actually don't migrate or trickle down or whatever your term is to people of color unless they're targeted. And so what we are actually focused on is how do we create universal approaches that actually are targeted for the communities that are situated to opportunity in different ways. So I'll frame it like this. If we were all in the mall together and opportunity is on the third floor, we could take different conveyances to get to the third floor. Some of us would take the escalator. Some of us would take the stairs. But if you're in a wheelchair, you couldn't take either one of those. You'd have to take a different way to get there. And so we created elevators. Now, you don't hear anybody screaming and hollering about building elevators. And elevators are expensive. It's an expensive proposition. But we all benefit from that solution that gets created to get us all to the third floor. So those are different strategies to get to opportunity because we're not all situated in the same way. I actually think we need to start reframing this question so that everybody can see themselves in the picture, realizing that we need different strategies to get there. This housing pathway that we're working on now at Prosperity Now at the federal level that's getting some traction actually is that framing so that everybody can see themselves in a picture. In Minnesota in particular, I've seen this over and over again where some of my great liberal friends, some of you on the phone call right now, are all for this, except when there's some cost to you. Well, there has to be some cost if we're going to change the trajectory. We're not going to get there without some change in how these structures happen. If you take, and I'm going to stop here, Ann, if you take how COVID vaccines have been distributed as an example, let's just take that as an example, where we know people of color in particular have been disproportionately impacted. But where and have they been prioritized? Have we said we're going to give Black people the vaccine first? Have we said we're going to give Latino and Asian people? No. And we keep acting like we're going to do something differently, but we continue the same pattern of disproportionate treatment of people of color. And they're not having this illness because there's something wrong with them at a disproportional rate. They're having this because the systems and structures have been designed for the outcomes that we're getting. And when we begin to actually grapple with this, and we begin to actually say we're going to do something significantly different, and we're not going to be just nice about it, but we're going to say that this is what we're going to, that's when we're going to see something different happen. On housing in particular, I can't say, and Paul Williams can tell you for sure, we can't spend another 30 years talking about a problem we've been talking about for 30 years. So the weight is on all of you. Unless you're willing to do the bold step that's necessary at the level of Minnesota and at the federal level, we're not going to get there. And I'm actually hopeful and optimistic at the federal level. I'm wondering what you're going to do in Minnesota. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Gary. I would expect no less than provocative and really important, challenging questions for this group right here. So thank you for teeing that up. I want to do, as I turn to the other panel members as well, to both react and then talk a little bit about their lens on these issues. I just want to encourage all of you who are listening to use the chat. I will try to monitor the chat and pick up questions that are coming through. So I'm going to just quickly introduce our panelists. We'll be starting in a minute here, and their full bios will be in the chat as well. I'm going to start with Vihar Sheth. He is the Director of Business Development for affordable housing investments at U.S. Bank Community Development Corporation. And he started with U.S. Bank back in 2003, is an expert in low-income housing tax credit investments and many other things that you'll see in a moment. And then we'll also have as a panelist Nawal Noor, who is an amazing individual, a founder and CEO of Noor Companies, which is a social enterprise that performs mission-based work in construction, real estate, and community engagement. It's the first East African developer and general contractor in Minnesota. And she'll talk a little bit about her business, has done an amazing business and has some really stellar projects that she's completed, including she was the general contractor for the recovery of the Target at East Lake Street, which was burned down after the killing of George Floyd, and as well as some other award-winning historical renovation at Hennepin County Hosmer's Library in South Minneapolis, and lots of other projects. So Vihar, why don't we start with you? If you want to just talk again, I think it's really interesting that as a large institution that has been engaged in this work, this is not a speedboat kind of response issue. We have barges moving along these rivers, and it takes a long time to turn the direction. Talk a little bit about your lens from U.S. Bank, about, again, how U.S. Bank and you are looking at this moment and these risks and opportunities.
Yeah, Anne, thank you for having me. And I will note for the audience that speedboats are very specifically banned at large banks. So we are on the barge journey. So I really appreciate everyone having me here. And I was flipping through the gallery and saw a lot of familiar faces. Even though I'm based in St. Louis, I've been working in the state of Minnesota for a very long time and recognize some folks. So it's good to see everybody digitally. I'm Vihar Sheth. I have been with U.S. Bank for 17 years. I manage a sliver of our business at the CDC, which is a subsidiary of U.S. Bank. And we deploy tax credit equity for affordable housing projects. And the CDC more broadly does a lot of community-based investing through primarily tax credits. And we also do construction lending and CDFI lending. We're very active in the new markets tax credit space and the renewable space as well. And, we'll get to this part of the discussion, but I think one of the underlying themes for us is all those things are incentives, and they've driven capital at scale towards certain needs in the community, and they're far from perfect resources, and they don't meet all the needs, but they are incentives. And that's, I think, a key component of making progress in a lot of these areas, especially at scale. And one of the things I did want to do to frame up here quickly is we've been really trying to reorient our business through an anti-racist lens. And we've been convening folks for a number of years for anti-bias, anti-racism workshops that we've sponsored, and some of you may have attended some of those. We do those nationally. But we also, in the last couple of years, developed a racial equity agenda. And it has 4 components. It's simply they're doing business with aligned partners and projects that meet the racial equity characteristics. We're starting with Black-owned and Black-led businesses, trying to provide responsive capital, and this is one of the barges. So we're doing what we can to shift our business to provide the types of lending investment opportunities the communities are asking for. We're creating access for POC-led organizations, trying to figure out ways to make them to be a more proportionate share of the partners that we do business with. And then we're convening, and I think this is the thing that we've excelled at for a number of years, and it's through sponsoring workshops and those types of things. And through all of that, we're trying to shift how we deploy our equity and our debt dollars. But to a lot of the conversation, even with what Gary was talking about there, we operate in the spaces that are kind of defined for us. And I'm speaking primarily about what the CDC does. The bank at large has a number of initiatives too. And I think some of the stuff that was mentioned on that slide for that plan, would align very well with lenders and our mortgage group and all that kind of stuff. So that's a high level. So I'll, give it back to you, Anne, and then we can keep the discussion going.
Great. Nawal, again, I am such a big fan of you and everything you're doing. I didn't mention, although I think it's in your written bio, you came to housing after almost a decade at Ecolab and sort of in the private sector doing other work. Um, and you've made an enormous impact in a short amount of time. Talk a little bit about, again, how you've done that, but also, and why, and then also, again, some of those challenges that you're facing as we look at how do we make sure that we're getting uh, uh, more perspectives, more talent into this field.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. And I am so excited to be among the speakers. Gary is a dear friend and a mentor, and so are a lot of the folks that are on the call today. So I'm excited and honored to be speaking with you this morning. I want to start off by just thanking the native land that we live on and the civil rights communities and leaders that I sit on their shoulders to be able to speak with you as a woman of color in front of all of you. So I want to just start out with that. My name is Nawal Noor. I'm the CEO of Noor Companies. It's a developer and a construction company, general contractor. Like Anne said, I have been in this industry for if you count the time that I spent with Aon, 12 years, the time that I've spent as a developer and now as a general contractor for the last 4 or 5 years working for other people. I started out as a work study intern at working for Alan Arthur when Aon was CCHT, Central Community Housing Trust. And prior to that, I was just an immigrant that came to the United States at 12 years old. And the reason I worked for Aon was because I lived in an Aon property because at the time that was the only property that would take an immigrant with no history of rent. And just to think about that, so Black family, immigrant, Muslim, and for the first time didn't speak a lot of English. So and today I speak with you. My background is computer science and finance. I spent 10 years in corporate America at Ecolab in progressive roles, and my last role was working in strategy and product development. And then I went to go on to MBA at Kellogg at Northwestern in Chicago. And I decided to start on my own company. And part of it was I wanted to start, if I had the wherewithal and the patience, I would have probably started a nonprofit. But because I was from corporate America, I wanted to start a social enterprise that had a quasi nonprofit mission with being able to use the dollars that we earn towards reasons that were for good. And so I started Noor Companies. We are a minority women-owned social enterprise, and we are centered on delivering exceptional construction projects and development projects with a very important lens on workforce development and inclusion. And so just to give you context, we haven't done a lot of projects, but we've done 10 projects so far, and all of those projects have received some sort of accolade or award, but that's not the reason I really love doing this. The reason I love this is because we've had over 30% of our work done by people of color, especially for the communities that we are from. And I'll just give you the last example we did was the $17 million recovery of East Lake Street. And that had 7% Native American. And the rest of the work was done by people of color. Over 40% was done by people of color and businesses of color. And that's not work that requires inclusion. It was a private work, but that was because we were committed to doing that. So we collaborate with our customers, public and private. We engage, design, and build sustainable, vibrant environments for communities that live and work and pursue their dreams. And one of the reasons I love that is because I'm an immigrant and I'm living my dream. And prior to that, I lived in affordable housing. I lived in Section 8 housing. And I think of Section 8 housing or any affordable housing as a bridge to get to that next level. And the unfortunate thing is that it's become a place where people are stuck because we don't have the resources and we don't give people the opportunities to be able to grow. And so how do we do that? A lot of the things that we've been talking, Gary and Jennifer, who I admire very much, her leadership. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. My computer is acting up, so I wanted to make sure that I'm not frozen. The reason I wanted to make sure that we kind of covered up all the issues that we've had, and so sorry to be a burden on kind of bringing up the bad things that are happening in affordable housing and why we're in this position, is that Gary and Ann both shared some statistics, but I want to add one more statistic that I've learned from the Urban Land Institute, and that is for very extremely low income households, which I was part of maybe 25 years ago, is that for every 100 families, there's only 29 adequate affordable housing available for them. And if you think about it, in Minnesota, the average wait list that families stay on Section 8 housing for the voucher is about 10 years. And when I came to this country, it was about 5 years. So it's got doubled in the number of years it takes you to get a voucher in just 20 years. So just to give you that context. And so the reason that I think from my lens, and I'm a young affordable housing developer, there's a lot of you that have been doing this a lot longer than I have, is we have, for example, 32 units that are in the wait list today. When we did the analysis for the 32 units that we're building, we came up with, we used some analysis that existed. So for example, 50 apartments units that are 30% AMI with no tax credits typically have a $12 million in deficit, meaning there's a gap of $12 million in there. If you add the land for free, and so the city gave you the land for free, that only brings down the cost to about $11 million. And so where do you fill that gap? Usually it's with tax credits. And typical projects take 3 years to be able to get funded. So why do they take 3 years to get funded? It's because we have scarcity in funding. And so Jennifer is in this, and her staff is in this all the time. And I had a short period of time serving on the honor of serving on the MHFA board. And part of the reason that the MHFA as an organization struggles with funding is because they get resources that are not enough to be able to fund the pipeline of affordable housing that exists today. So what that causes is that it increases the pre-development cost. So land acquisition, you're holding the land, so it costs you more through interest. Consultants, lawyers, every time you apply for an application, it takes you a lot longer. So now you have to pay every year you reapply, or every round that you reapply, you're spending application fee. And the other thing that we don't take into account is that the applications get a lot more complex every year. They don't get less complex every year, which is kind of ironic, because technically you want to make sure that you are lowering the cost of affordable housing, but it's been going the other way where it's increasing the affordable housing. And the last item that goes into the cost of affordable housing is construction. And that's kind of the place that I serve as a general contractor. And the land and acquisition costs are pretty much going up, but construction is going up double most of the time, because workforce is aging, right? We're not getting additional workforce. And so that's one of the reasons why I started this workforce development. There are people we have 10% unemployment, for example, yet we have shortage in workforce in construction, especially in a place that pays, most of my people get paid $100,000 or more. And so it's more than livable wages. The idea is, how do you close the gap, and how do you get people together so they're working in places that need them and they have the skill set to be able to do that work. Mm-hmm. And so that's just one of the aspects that I think about as we think about what are the innovative ways to help build more affordable housing. So how do we solve this problem, right? what are the solutions? We don't want to just keep talking about it like Gary said. So here's a couple of solutions that I'd like to identify. One thing that bothers me about the work on disparities is that people are always talking about disparities. We're working on disparities. Well, forgive me, I come from corporate America. Either you're doing it or you're not doing it, right? There's nothing that says we're working on it, right? A product is either viable or it's not, and it's not viable. A program is either a program that's viable and you're going to execute, or it's not. A project is either going to get funded or it's not. Disparities are the same way. We're either going to do something about it or we're going to talk about it for the next 30 years. And I certainly want to make sure that we're not talking about it for the next 30 years. So how do we get solutions that help on disparities and help on affordable housing? One thing that I want to commend on MHFA, for the first time, the application this year gives you 7 points if you hire a BIPOC organization. That's a very, very commendable incentive to increase people of color being able to participate in building the stock of affordable housing. And I commend the organization to do that, more of those things. And we need to do that, and we need to continue to incentivize organizations to be able to do more of that. Whether it's the construction companies, whether it's the development, or whether it's the funder being able to say, here's equity dollars that I'm going to give you if you use, or if you include people of color in your capital stack, if you include them in your project, and if you include them in your partnerships. All of those things help. And incentives are the best way to be able to achieve that. Mm-hmm. The second thing is it takes partnership of state and city and funders, and transparency on the application, making sure that projects don't stay in the pipeline for 3, 4, 5 years and wait for funding. For example, this year, there were 3 applications that I'm aware of that are developers of color. None of them got funding, and all of them got an early rejection from MHFA. So you ponder the question of why, and how do we help to make sure that organizations of color can participate in the development process, and that their projects are funded and are successful. And if they're not viable, let them know early enough so they can do something else, and they're not spending money that they could be using on something else that is more viable. So it takes partnership, right? But I also commend the organization. This year, the HIB did not get, the funding application was too late, right? It took a long time for that. The agents didn't even know if they were going to get HIB. And final thing that I want to just add on the funding side is that we have typically 9% tax credit allocation every year. To me, that is not a good way to fund. You know, the state of Minnesota has how many nonprofits that are all doing affordable housing? If only one can be funded through every round, I mean, we're not going to make a difference. We have to be able to change that number. That doesn't make sense to me. But that's just coming from someone who hasn't been in this for as long as all of you have. So I admire that. But we need to change that number. So simplifying the application is the other thing, and making sure that it's easier for people to be able to do that. And then the last thing that I would like to say is that construction innovation needs to take place. It's more than just creating prefab walls. Typically, prefab walls are just the starting point, and usually they haven't been, to this point, they still have not created a more affordable way to build. They're just one element. But the other piece that is really important, and I know some architects are on this call, which I really appreciate, it's partnerships between architects, funders, and builders to eliminate inefficiencies in the design, material selection, training, constructability of the project, and workforce development. And those partnerships are so crucial to be able to change the trajectory of where we are today.
Well, Nawal, you have been very specific, and I appreciate sort of lifting up some of the specifics, both that are working in terms of some of the targeting and pointing and being intentional to what Gary had earlier said. I wonder if I can ask all of you, and Vihar, particularly you, and as you're looking at, in 1986, the low-income housing tax credit was created out of a tax reform bill. You know, it's odd that the IRS is really regulating the largest affordable housing tool in the country, right? So we are, again, if we think big and bold, another piece of legislation, other kinds of these opportunities could also change the trajectory of how we actually create housing. Because the whole industry emerged out of that 1986 legislation. So as this and Gary, you might have some perspectives on that too, as this new administration federally is looking at how, what are these tools to really change the frame of how we approach affordable housing in this way. What do you envision as most impactful that we could see? Is it universal rental assistance or a new tax policy approach? What are those tools that could really move the ball forward? And I want to say there's a question in the chat related to this from Mary Tingerthal, Gary, about when we're looking at that level of this secondary market and the requirements in there as well. So what are these sort of more structural changes that might have an impact? And Vihar, maybe I'll quickly start with you and then shift to Gary.
Sure. That's a great question. It's something we struggle with all the time. And I think one of the big issues is that the low-income housing tax credit has assumed this gravity to it, and it has become the core element of trying to solve all of our different, very kind of discrete issues in the community. And I think one of the things we struggle with, and Noel pointed it out too with the 9%, is that you apply for tax credits, and if you don't get them, you almost can't do anything, whether it's build senior housing, build assisted living in certain states, address homelessness. There are components of infrastructure that go into it. Costs are shared to provide commercial space and retail and all that kind of stuff when you layer in markets and those types of things. And so I think part of it is that we keep throwing more resources at the program, which is great. But to Noel's point, unlike in a lot of industries, efficiency hasn't gotten better, right? The cost to produce each unit, and there are obviously inflationary pressures, but the cost to produce a unit is extremely high and takes an extremely long time. And so I think to Gary's comments earlier, we need the top-down and bottom-up approach. We need to design modern programs to address old and new issues. And I think, things like the renewable energy tax credit came out, and that helped in the energy space. I think there are discrete things that we can address nationally, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's aspects of housing, some of the plans that Gary laid out with interest deductions, credits for home ownership. Because the thing that we have talked about is that while there are a lot of flaws to the LifeSite program, it has been the core thing that has maintained some semblance, of affordable units in the country. So, and I obviously make my living off of it. So it's a great program, but it can't be everything to everyone. And we're in a position right now in the housing space, the affordable housing space, where it needs to be everything to everyone. And that makes it really far less efficient than it should be.
Gary, we could go on for a full hour, another hour on all of these questions. We're getting very close to time, but I wonder if you can also respond to that briefly.
Well, let me start by saying, number one, we have to reimagine and redesign the CRA, meaning the CRA sits at the center. If CRA had been implemented the way it was designed, we would have been in a totally different space now. But again, this issue of holding folks accountable for outcomes is critical. I think Mary's question about the secondary market is not only important in housing, it's also important in business lending as well. And opening up these markets so that first-time home buyers can actually buy into that. I do know that Freddie and Fannie are putting more money in this year than ever before, and to try to address some of these issues, but it's not enough. I mean, even when we look at some of the solutions we have, we've got tools that we're using to solve a problem that it's like we're trying to use a screwdriver to fix a computer. Just not going to work. And so we need to really reinvent new tools. I was on a call, and I know we have to go, so I'll be brief. I was on a call on affordable housing with the San Francisco Foundation recently, and they have as severe or worse problems on affordable housing than in the city of Minneapolis. And they're thinking about actually buying up huge swaths of property and then setting it aside, using some of the tools that we have in Minnesota to actually, but at a magnitude of the level of the problem. So if we're not willing to do that, it's at the federal level or at the state level or at the city level, then we're not going to solve the problem. So I would say you got to think bigger and bolder about what you do. I would put that on the table. So yes, we've written letters. We're on board with all of what's been happening. But even with that, I don't think it's going to be enough. This country actually got founded off of giving free land to individuals in the Homesteader Act. Why wouldn't we think at that level of the problem?
Mm-hmm.
Right? We got to think at that. If we're not thinking at that level of the
Absolutely.
problem, we're not going to get there. And I know you're trying to close me down, but all I can say is think bigger. The solutions that we had in the past won't address the problems that we have today. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Again, I feel like there is so much more to have a discussion about. We want to respect everyone's time. I know folks will have other meetings to get to in their day, but I really want to thank our panelists. I just want to note, before we just do the final closeout, I'm going to hand it off to our MHP's board chair, Aaron Mathern, in just a second to take us home. I'll note that there's a link in the chat, but also in your email for a quick 1-minute evaluation of this, just so we want to make sure that we're bringing programming that is interesting and relevant to your work. More to come on that. Thank you so much to our panelists. And Erin, I'm going to give you 1 minute to take us home.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. I'm Erin Mathern. I'm the board chair of MHP. And so first, I would be remiss if I didn't thank all of the members and participants in the Investors Council. Thanks so much for continuing to be supportive of this really important work that MHP does, especially the Diamond level members, Bridgewater Bank with Irvin Weinstein, Colliers, and Dominium. And what I would say this morning is just that I was thinking this morning about the quality and depth of the discussion that we're having. And I recall the first times that I came to the Investors Council when we were in person. To me, it seemed like it was sort of an update on the industry and an opportunity for those of us who know each other well, who work in affordable housing in Minnesota, to get together, see each other in person, and sort of share information about the work that we're doing. And in the last year, this has very much become a place where we do that, but we also look to solutions. I think that this organization has become so much more solution focused and really has worked to shed light on, these greater issues that we're facing in affordable housing, primarily issues of equity and access, and also equity and access to financing. So I just wanted to thank everybody for joining this morning. And then I wanted to remind you that if you have not yet made your contribution or renewed your contribution to the Investors Council for 2021, we ask you to do that. It's really important work that's being done, and it supports the broader focus of Minnesota Housing Partnership. 2021 will be a pivotal year, I think, for affordable housing in many, many ways, and the Investors Council is a great place to get the very latest and most important information and to get together to work on solutions to these issues that we're talking about. So thanks everyone for joining. It's nice to see many of your faces on video. I hope that we get to see each other in person soon.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.